What would you say if I told you that a Creek Indian from Oklahoma, who grew up in poverty and faced discrimination his entire life, would become one of the most decorated soldiers in World War II? What if I told you that this man, fighting with a broken foot, single-handedly took out 2 German machine gun nests and 8 enemy soldiers, changing the course of a battle in Italy? You probably wouldn't believe me, but that's exactly what Ernest Childers did on September 22, 1943, earning him the Medal of Honor and a place in history as the first Native American in World War II to receive America's highest military decoration. This is a story that deserves to be told, shared, and remembered. If you're hearing about Ernest Childers for the first time, I need you to do something important right now. Drop a comment below telling me what you think about this incredible story. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because stories like this get buried by the algorithm every single day. Your engagement, your likes, your shares, they all help make sure that heroes like Ernest Childers aren't forgotten by history. This man deserves to have his story heard by millions, not just thousands. Ernest Childers was born on February 1, 1918 in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. He came into a world that didn't want him to succeed. He was a member of the Muskogee Creek Nation, and in the early 20th century, being Native American in Oklahoma meant facing obstacles at every turn. His family didn't have much. They struggled to put food on the table. They lived in conditions that most Americans today couldn't imagine. But Ernest's parents taught him something that money couldn't buy: dignity, courage, and the value of standing up for what's right. Growing up, Ernest saw firsthand what inequality looked like. Native Americans were treated as second-class citizens in their own homeland. They faced discrimination in schools, in businesses, and in everyday life. Many people didn't think Native Americans belonged in modern society. Some didn't even think they were capable of the same achievements as white Americans. Ernest would spend his entire life proving them wrong. The 1920s and 1930s were difficult decades for everyone in America, but they were especially hard for Native American families in Oklahoma. Ernest grew up during the Great Depression, when jobs disappeared and families went hungry. The Dust Bowl turned fertile farmland into desert, and thousands of people fled Oklahoma looking for better lives elsewhere. For Native Americans like the Childers family, opportunities were even more limited than they were for their white neighbors. Ernest attended school in Broken Arrow, where he faced challenges that had nothing to do with his intelligence or abilities. The education system at the time didn't value Native American students. Many teachers had low expectations for indigenous children. Some schools actively discouraged Native American culture and language. Students were sometimes punished for speaking their native languages or practicing their traditions. It was a system designed to erase indigenous identity and force assimilation. But Ernest was determined. He understood that education was one of the few ways to build a better future. He worked hard in school despite the discrimination he faced. He proved to be intelligent, capable, and ambitious. His teachers who bothered to pay attention noticed that he had something special, a quiet determination that couldn't be shaken by prejudice or hardship. Outside of school, Ernest learned skills that would later save his life and the lives of his fellow soldiers. He learned to hunt and track in the Oklahoma wilderness. He learned patience and observation. He learned how to move quietly through terrain and how to read the landscape. These weren't skills taught in textbooks. They were passed down through generations of Creek tradition, skills that his ancestors had perfected over centuries. Nobody knew it at the time, but these traditional Native American skills would make Ernest one of the most effective soldiers in the United States Army. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and the world was plunged into another devastating war. At first, America tried to stay out of the conflict. Most Americans remembered the horrors of World War I and wanted no part in another European war. But as Germany conquered France and began bombing Britain, it became clear that the United States wouldn't be able to remain neutral forever. Ernest Childers watched these events unfold like millions of other young American men. He was 21 years old when the war started in Europe. He could have chosen to ignore what was happening across the ocean. He could have focused on building his own life in Oklahoma. But Ernest understood something important. The values of freedom and democracy were worth fighting for, even if those same values hadn't always been extended to him and his people. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and everything changed. America declared war on Japan, and days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. The country mobilized for total war. Factories converted to produce weapons and vehicles. Millions of men registered for the draft. Women went to work in factories and shipyards. The entire nation transformed itself into a war machine. Native Americans faced a complicated situation. They had been treated as outsiders in their own country for generations. Many had been forced onto reservations. Their children had been taken away to boarding schools designed to destroy their culture. The government that now asked them to fight had spent centuries trying to eliminate them. Some Native Americans questioned why they should fight for a country that had treated them so poorly. But the vast majority, including Ernest Childers, made a different choice. They chose to serve. More than 44,000 Native Americans served in World War II, including thousands of women. As a percentage of population, Native Americans had one of the highest rates of military service of any ethnic group in the country. They served for many reasons: patriotism, a warrior tradition that went back centuries, economic opportunity, and a belief that their service might lead to better treatment after the war. Ernest Childers enlisted with all of these motivations, but above all, he believed in defending freedom. Ernest joined the Oklahoma National Guard before the attack on Pearl Harbor. When the United States entered the war, his National Guard unit was federalized and became part of the regular Army. He was assigned to the 180th Infantry Regiment, 45th Infantry Division. This division had a special connection to Native Americans. Its shoulder patch featured a golden Thunderbird on a red diamond background, a symbol chosen to honor the Native American heritage of many soldiers from Oklahoma, New Mexico, Arizona, and Colorado who filled its ranks. Basic training was tough for everyone, but Ernest excelled. The physical challenges that broke other recruits didn't faze him. He was used to hard work and discomfort from his childhood in Oklahoma. The discipline and structure of military life came naturally to him. His ability to move quietly and observe carefully, skills learned from Creek hunting traditions, impressed his instructors. He was a natural soldier. But even in the Army, Ernest couldn't entirely escape racism. Some officers and fellow soldiers held prejudiced views about Native Americans. They made crude jokes and used slurs. They questioned whether Indians could be trusted in combat. Some believed that Native Americans were naturally violent but couldn't be counted on to follow orders. Ernest dealt with these attitudes the same way he had dealt with discrimination his entire life, with quiet dignity and by letting his actions speak louder than their words. The 45th Infantry Division trained intensively throughout 1942. They learned infantry tactics, weapons handling, and how to work together as a cohesive unit. Ernest proved himself again and again. His superiors recognized his leadership potential and his skill. Despite the prejudice he faced, his abilities couldn't be denied. He was promoted to corporal, then to sergeant. He became a squad leader, responsible for the lives of the men under his command. In 1943, the 45th Infantry Division received orders to deploy overseas. They were heading to North Africa to join the fight against Germany and Italy. For Ernest and thousands of other young American soldiers, this was it. All the training was over. They were going to war. The 45th Infantry Division landed in North Africa in June 1943. By this time, the Afrika Korps had already been defeated, and the Allies were preparing for the next phase of the campaign, the invasion of Sicily. Ernest and his fellow soldiers didn't have long to adjust to the African heat before they were loading onto ships again, this time heading for Sicily. Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, began on July 10, 1943. It was one of the largest amphibious operations of the war up to that point. More than 150,000 Allied troops stormed the beaches of Sicily, facing determined resistance from German and Italian forces. The 45th Infantry Division landed at Scogliti on the southern coast of the island. Ernest Childers saw combat for the first time on those Sicilian beaches. The experience of being shot at, of seeing friends wounded and killed, of smelling gunpowder and blood was something no amount of training could prepare someone for. Many soldiers froze in their first battle, paralyzed by fear. Others panicked and broke. But Ernest remained calm. His training took over. He led his squad forward, keeping them focused on their objectives, making sure they supported each other. He showed the qualities that would define his entire combat career: courage under fire, tactical intelligence, and an absolute refusal to abandon his men. The fighting in Sicily was brutal. The terrain was mountainous and difficult. German forces, even though they were eventually withdrawing from the island, fought skillfully and inflicted heavy casualties. Temperatures soared above 100 degrees. Water was scarce. Soldiers marched for miles carrying heavy equipment in the blazing sun, then had to fight when they encountered the enemy. Ernest's squad was involved in numerous firefights as they pushed inland. They cleared villages house by house. They assaulted German positions on hilltops. They endured artillery barrages and mortar fire. Through it all, Ernest demonstrated the leadership and bravery that earned him the respect of every man in his unit. His Creek heritage, his knowledge of tracking and movement, gave him an edge in reading terrain and anticipating enemy positions. What some officers had once dismissed as primitive skills proved invaluable in modern warfare. The campaign in Sicily lasted 38 days. The 45th Infantry Division fought its way across the island, engaging German and Italian forces in dozens of battles. Ernest Childers was in the thick of the fighting. He led patrols into enemy territory, he helped capture key positions, he kept his squad alive through some of the most intense combat any of them had ever experienced. One of the characteristics that made Ernest exceptional was his concern for his men. Many soldiers in combat become focused purely on survival. They do what they need to do to stay alive. But Ernest never forgot that he was responsible for the lives of the men in his squad. He made decisions based not just on completing the mission, but on bringing his men home. He took risks himself to minimize the danger to others. His soldiers knew that Sergeant Childers would never ask them to do something he wouldn't do himself. The fighting in Sicily also revealed the complexity of combat in World War II. The Germans were skilled, experienced fighters. Many of them had been fighting since 1939. They knew how to use terrain to their advantage. They were experts at defensive warfare. Even as they retreated, they made the Allies pay for every mile of ground. Italian forces were less motivated, and many Italian soldiers surrendered as soon as they had the opportunity. But in some places, Italian units fought fiercely, especially when defending their own homeland. Ernest witnessed the full spectrum of human behavior in combat. He saw incredible acts of courage and heartbreaking moments of cowardice. He saw men sacrifice themselves to save their friends. He saw others break under the stress and refuse to fight. He learned that combat revealed who people truly were. There was no pretending in battle. Fear, courage, selfishness, and sacrifice were all laid bare. By August 17, 1943, Sicily was in Allied hands. The 45th Infantry Division had performed exceptionally well. They had achieved all their objectives despite heavy resistance. But the cost had been high. Hundreds of men from the division had been killed. Thousands more were wounded. Ernest had survived, but he had lost friends. He had seen things that would haunt him for the rest of his life. And he knew the war was far from over. After Sicily fell, the Allies prepared for the next step, the invasion of mainland Italy. The strategic goal was to knock Italy out of the war and open up a new front against Germany. The plan called for Allied forces to land at multiple locations on the Italian coast and then push northward toward Rome and beyond. The 45th Infantry Division was given a brief rest after the Sicily campaign, but it wasn't long before they were preparing for the next operation. Ernest used this time to write letters home to Oklahoma. Like many soldiers, he didn't tell his family about the true horrors of what he was experiencing. He kept his letters positive and reassuring. He told them he was fine and that he hoped to be home soon. He didn't mention the friends he had lost or the fear he felt before each battle. During this preparation period, Ernest also reflected on what he had learned in Sicily. He thought about tactics that had worked and mistakes that had cost lives. He talked with his squad about what they could do better. He studied maps and learned everything he could about the Italian terrain they would soon be fighting in. Ernest understood that preparation and knowledge saved lives. The more he knew before going into battle, the better chance he and his men had of surviving. On September 3, 1943, Allied forces began landing in southern Italy. The 45th Infantry Division landed at Salerno on September 9 as part of Operation Avalanche. This was one of the most dangerous operations of the war. The Germans knew the Allies were coming and had prepared strong defenses. The fighting at Salerno was desperate and intense. For several days, the outcome was in doubt. German counterattacks nearly drove the Allies back into the sea. The 45th Infantry Division fought tenaciously to secure and expand the beachhead. Ernest's squad was involved in repelling German counterattacks and clearing enemy positions. The Germans fought with everything they had, knowing that if the Allies secured a foothold in Italy, the entire Mediterranean strategy would shift. Artillery and tank fire pounded American positions. German aircraft strafed the beaches. It was chaos and carnage. Once the Salerno beachhead was secure, the 45th Infantry Division began the long, grinding campaign northward through Italy. The Italian landscape was a defender's paradise and an attacker's nightmare. The entire country was covered with mountains, rivers, and narrow valleys. The Germans used the terrain brilliantly, setting up defensive positions on hilltops and mountain ridges where they could see the Americans coming from miles away. The weather made everything worse. Fall and winter in Italy brought cold rain that turned dirt roads into rivers of mud. Soldiers lived in wet uniforms for weeks at a time. Trench foot became a serious problem. Supply lines struggled to get food, ammunition, and medical supplies to the front lines. Mules became essential for moving supplies up mountain paths too steep and muddy for vehicles. Ernest and his squad adapted to these harsh conditions. They learned to find shelter wherever they could. They learned to keep their weapons clean and functional in the mud and rain. They learned to move through mountainous terrain while avoiding German observers. The skills Ernest had learned as a creek hunter in Oklahoma proved valuable again. He could read the landscape, find the best routes, and sense when danger was near. The fighting was constant but not always dramatic. Sometimes entire days would pass with only occasional sniper fire or distant artillery. Other times, fierce battles would erupt as American forces tried to take a German-held village or hilltop. The Germans would defend fiercely, inflicting casualties, and then fall back to the next defensive position. Then the whole process would start again. This type of warfare was exhausting, not just physically but mentally. Soldiers never knew when the next attack would come. They never felt safe. Sleep was interrupted by artillery fire or the need to stand guard. The constant stress wore men down. Some soldiers developed what was called combat fatigue, a psychological breakdown caused by too much exposure to combat. Others became reckless, taking unnecessary risks because they had stopped caring whether they lived or died. Ernest somehow maintained his focus and his humanity through all of it. September 22, 1943, started like many other days for Ernest Childers and his squad. They were in the mountains near Oliveto, Italy. The 45th Infantry Division was pushing forward against German defensive positions. Intelligence indicated that German forces were dug in on the high ground ahead, using machine guns and mortars to prevent any American advance. Ernest's company received orders to attack and clear the German positions. It was a dangerous assignment. The Germans held the high ground and had clear fields of fire. Any approach would be exposed and vulnerable. But orders were orders, and Ernest prepared his squad for the assault. He checked their weapons and ammunition. He went over the plan. He looked each man in the eye and gave them confidence. Then they moved out. Before the attack even began, Ernest was already dealing with a serious problem. He had injured his foot days earlier, and the injury had become worse. Walking was painful. Running was agony. Most soldiers would have reported to the medical station and gotten off the front line. But Ernest knew his squad needed him. He knew that leadership in combat made the difference between life and death. He wrapped his foot as tightly as he could, took whatever pain he could tolerate, and led his men forward. The attack began with American artillery pounding the German positions. The shells screamed overhead and exploded on the hilltop where the Germans were entrenched. Then the artillery stopped, and it was time for the infantry to advance. Ernest's squad moved forward with the rest of the company, using whatever cover they could find. Rocks, small trees, depressions in the ground, anything that might stop a bullet. The Germans held their fire at first, waiting for the Americans to get closer. Then all hell broke loose. Machine guns opened up from multiple positions. The distinctive sound of German MG-42 machine guns, which fired so fast they sounded like ripping cloth, filled the air. Bullets snapped past Ernest's head. Men around him fell, some dead before they hit the ground, others crying out in pain. The advance stalled as soldiers dove for cover. The American attack had ground to a halt. German machine guns had the entire area covered. Anyone who tried to advance was cut down. The company was pinned down, unable to move forward or backward without suffering heavy casualties. Officers shouted orders, but there was no good solution. Someone needed to do something about those machine gun nests, or the entire attack would fail. Ernest Childers assessed the situation quickly. He could see where the German fire was coming from. There were at least 2 machine gun positions, well protected and expertly positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. Taking them out would require someone to get close enough to use grenades or rifles. It would require someone to expose themselves to enemy fire while moving across open ground. It was almost certainly a suicide mission. Ernest didn't hesitate. He told his squad to provide covering fire and started moving. His injured foot screamed with pain with every step, but he ignored it. He used every bit of cover available, moving from rock to rock, from tree to tree. German bullets kicked up dirt around him. He could hear them cracking through the air inches from his body, but he kept moving. He worked his way to the flank of the first machine gun position. The Germans were focused on the main body of American troops and didn't see Ernest approaching from the side. He got close enough to throw a grenade. He pulled the pin, counted, and threw. The grenade arced through the air and landed perfectly in the German position. The explosion silenced the machine gun. Ernest didn't wait to see the results. He was already moving toward the next position. The second machine gun crew had seen what happened to the first position and knew someone was flanking them. They tried to swing their weapon around to engage Ernest, but he was too fast. Despite his injured foot, despite the pain, despite the exhaustion, Ernest moved with the grace and speed of a warrior. He got another grenade ready and threw it. Another perfect throw. Another explosion. The second machine gun fell silent. Silencing the 2 machine gun nests had opened up the American advance, but Ernest Childers wasn't finished. With the immediate threat neutralized, the rest of the company was able to move forward. But the Germans weren't giving up easily. More enemy soldiers appeared, some firing rifles from cover, others trying to set up new defensive positions. Ernest spotted a group of German soldiers attempting to establish another machine gun position. If they succeeded, the American advance would be stopped again. He couldn't let that happen. Even though he was exhausted, even though his foot was now causing him almost unbearable pain, Ernest moved forward again. He engaged the German soldiers with his rifle. Ernest was an excellent shot, a skill he had developed hunting in Oklahoma. He fired carefully and accurately, making every bullet count. One German soldier fell, then another. The rest scattered, abandoning the machine gun. But they didn't flee. German soldiers at this stage of the war were well trained and disciplined. They took cover and returned fire. What happened next demonstrated not just Ernest's courage, but his tactical intelligence. He didn't just charge forward blindly. He used the terrain to his advantage, moving in a way that made him difficult to hit while keeping pressure on the Germans. He used the same tracking and hunting skills his ancestors had used for generations, but now applied to modern warfare. He anticipated where the Germans would be and positioned himself accordingly. Over the course of the battle, Ernest personally killed 8 German soldiers. That's a staggering number for one man in a single engagement. But more importantly, his actions had broken the German defensive position and allowed his entire company to advance. What might have been a failed attack with massive American casualties instead became a success. The high ground was taken, the mission was accomplished. When the battle finally ended and the position was secure, Ernest's fellow soldiers and officers realized what he had done. Despite being injured, despite facing overwhelming enemy fire, despite every reason to stay in cover and protect himself, Ernest Childers had single-handedly turned the tide of the battle. His company commander immediately recommended him for the Medal of Honor. The Medal of Honor is the highest military decoration that can be awarded by the United States government. It is given for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. The medal has been awarded only 3,600 times since it was created during the Civil War. It represents the absolute pinnacle of military heroism. When Ernest Childers was recommended for the Medal of Honor, his actions had to be investigated and verified. Multiple witnesses were interviewed. Officers reviewed the battle reports. The recommendation went up through multiple levels of command. Every detail was checked and confirmed. The military didn't award the Medal of Honor lightly. There had to be absolute certainty that the actions taken met the extraordinarily high standard. In Ernest's case, there was no doubt. Multiple officers and enlisted men testified to what they had witnessed. They described how Ernest had moved forward under intense enemy fire while injured. They explained how his actions had broken the German defensive position and saved countless American lives. They made it clear that without Ernest's courage and initiative, the attack would have failed, and many more men would have died. On April 8, 1944, Lieutenant Ernest Childers was awarded the Medal of Honor. The citation read, "He led his squad up a hill toward a strong enemy position, but they were pinned down by furious automatic weapons and small arms fire. Lieutenant Childers left his men in covered positions and, despite heavy fire, made his way to a position near the enemy machine guns. He attacked and silenced 2 machine guns and captured 1 prisoner. He continued up the hill against strong enemy fire and silenced 2 more machine guns. The Germans had been using these machine guns to stop the American advance and were holding on to every inch of ground. Lieutenant Childers later killed 8 more Germans in cleaning out an enemy position." Note that by the time the medal was awarded, Ernest had been promoted to second lieutenant. His heroism on September 22, 1943, had been recognized not just with the Medal of Honor, but with a promotion to officer rank. Ernest Childers, the Creek Indian from Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, who had grown up in poverty and faced discrimination his entire life, was now Lieutenant Childers, Medal of Honor recipient, and one of the most decorated soldiers in the United States Army. Ernest Childers' Medal of Honor carried special significance because he was the first Native American to receive the decoration in World War II. This was a powerful symbol for indigenous communities across America. For generations, Native Americans had been told they were inferior, that they couldn't compete with white Americans, that they had no place in modern society. Ernest's medal proved all of those racist ideas wrong. Native Americans had always had warrior traditions. For centuries before European contact, indigenous peoples across North America had their own systems of recognizing bravery and military achievement. Warriors earned respect through their actions in battle. Courage, skill, and sacrifice were honored and celebrated. When Native Americans joined the United States military, they brought these warrior traditions with them. Ernest Childers was following in the footsteps of countless Native American warriors who had come before him. But Ernest was also blazing a new trail. He was proving that Native Americans could achieve the highest honors in the modern American military. His Medal of Honor wasn't just a recognition of one man's bravery. It was a statement about the capabilities and worth of all Native Americans. It challenged the prejudices and stereotypes that had been used to justify discrimination for generations. News of Ernest's Medal of Honor spread quickly through Native American communities. He became a hero not just for the 45th Infantry Division or the United States Army, but for indigenous people across the country. Parents pointed to Ernest as an example of what their children could achieve. Young Native American men saw Ernest as proof that they too could serve with distinction and earn respect for their bravery. It's important to note that while Ernest was the first Native American to win the Medal of Honor in World War II, he wouldn't be the last. Van Barfoot, a Choctaw Indian, would earn the Medal of Honor in May 1944. Jack Montgomery, a Cherokee, would also receive the medal for actions in Italy in February 1944. These men, along with Ernest, showed that Native Americans served with extraordinary courage and distinction throughout the war. After his Medal of Honor action, Ernest Childers needed medical attention for his injured foot. What he had dismissed as a minor injury had become much worse because he had continued fighting on it. The foot was severely damaged and required significant treatment. Ernest was evacuated from the front lines and sent to a hospital for recovery. The recovery period gave Ernest time to process everything he had experienced. Combat had changed him, as it changed every soldier who experienced it. He had seen friends die. He had killed enemy soldiers. He had faced his own death multiple times. These experiences left scars that weren't visible, but were just as real as any physical wound. But Ernest also had time to reflect on what his Medal of Honor meant. He received letters from Native Americans across the country congratulating him and thanking him for representing indigenous people with such distinction. He heard from his family in Oklahoma, who were immensely proud but also worried about him. He understood that he had become more than just a soldier. He was now a symbol. Once Ernest recovered sufficiently, he faced a decision. He could have taken a rear echelon assignment, perhaps training new soldiers or working in an administrative capacity. No one would have blamed him. He had already proven his courage beyond any doubt. He had earned the right to a safer position. But that wasn't who Ernest Childers was. He requested to return to his unit and to combat. Ernest rejoined the 45th Infantry Division in Italy and continued fighting. He participated in the push toward Rome and beyond. He led soldiers in combat again and again. His presence inspired the men around him. They knew they were serving with a Medal of Honor recipient, and they knew that Ernest Childers would never ask them to do something he wouldn't do himself. His leadership by example continued throughout the Italian campaign. The Italian campaign would continue until May 1945, making it one of the longest and most difficult campaigns of the entire war. The 45th Infantry Division fought from southern Italy all the way to the Alps in the north, battling German forces every step of the way. It was brutal, grinding warfare with little glory and a high cost in casualties. Ernest continued to serve with distinction throughout the campaign. He wasn't looking for more medals or recognition. He was focused on his duty and on keeping his men alive. The Italian mountains, the winter weather, the determined German resistance, all of these challenges were met by Ernest with the same calm determination he had always shown. The fighting in Italy often felt forgotten compared to other theaters of the war. The newspapers back home focused on the preparations for D-Day and the liberation of France. The Pacific Theater got attention because of dramatic battles like Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima. But the soldiers in Italy kept fighting and dying in mountains that most Americans couldn't find on a map. They called themselves the Forgotten Front, and in many ways, they were right. But Ernest and his fellow soldiers in the 45th Infantry Division knew they were making a crucial contribution to the war effort. Every German division tied down in Italy was a division that couldn't be used against the invasion of France or on the Eastern Front against the Soviets. Every German soldier killed or captured in Italy was one less enemy to fight elsewhere. The Italian campaign mattered, even if it didn't get the headlines. Ernest witnessed the full scope of the war in Italy. He saw ancient Roman ruins destroyed by modern artillery. He saw Italian civilians caught in the crossfire, their homes and livelihoods destroyed by a war they hadn't wanted. He saw German prisoners who looked relieved to be out of the fighting, and others who remained defiant Nazis to the end. He saw the best and worst of humanity in the chaos of war. In the spring of 1945, the war in Europe finally began to end. Germany was being crushed from all sides. The Soviets were pushing from the east, the British and Americans from the west, and the forces in Italy were breaking through the last German defensive lines in the north. Hitler committed suicide in his bunker in Berlin on April 30, 1945. On May 8, 1945, Germany officially surrendered. The war in Europe was over. For Ernest Childers and the men of the 45th Infantry Division, the end of the fighting brought a complex mix of emotions. There was relief, of course. The constant danger was finally over. No more artillery, no more machine guns, no more friends dying in front of them. But there was also sadness for all those who hadn't survived to see this day. And there was uncertainty about what came next. Ernest had been at war for 2 years. Combat had become his normal life. He had learned to live with danger and death as constant companions. Now he had to figure out how to be a civilian again. He had to find a way to process all the things he had experienced. He had to deal with the memories that would never go away. The 45th Infantry Division was sent to Germany as part of the occupation force. They helped maintain order in the defeated country and began the process of demobilization. Ernest stayed with his unit, continuing to serve and lead even though the fighting was done. He helped younger soldiers adjust to the sudden peace. He made sure his men were taken care of during the transition from war to occupation. During this time, Ernest also learned about the full extent of Nazi atrocities. The 45th Infantry Division had been one of the units that liberated Dachau concentration camp in April 1945. The horrors they found there shocked even combat-hardened veterans. Ernest saw firsthand the evil that they had been fighting against. It gave new meaning to all the sacrifices that had been made. Ernest Childers finally returned to the United States in 1945. After years of war, he was coming home to Oklahoma. The young man who had left Broken Arrow to go to war was now a decorated hero, a Medal of Honor recipient, and a combat veteran who had seen and done things most people couldn't imagine. The homecoming was bittersweet. Ernest was proud of his service and proud of what he and his fellow soldiers had accomplished. They had helped defeat Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. They had fought for freedom and democracy. But the cost had been enormous. So many friends had been lost. So many men would never come home. Ernest carried those losses with him. He also came home to a country that hadn't changed nearly as much as he had hoped. Despite the fact that Native Americans had served with distinction in World War II, they still faced discrimination. The same prejudices that had existed before the war were still there. In some places, Native American veterans were denied service at restaurants and hotels. They were turned away from jobs. They were treated as second-class citizens despite having fought and bled for their country. This was deeply frustrating for Ernest and thousands of other Native American veterans. They had proven their loyalty and courage beyond any doubt. They had earned the respect of their fellow soldiers in combat. But back home, many white Americans still held on to racist attitudes. Ernest had earned the Medal of Honor, the highest recognition America could give, but he still faced discrimination because of his Creek heritage. Despite these challenges, Ernest worked to build a new life. He got married and started a family. He used the GI Bill to further his education, taking advantage of benefits that the government provided to veterans. He became involved in veterans organizations and worked to help other veterans adjust to civilian life. He spoke about his experiences and about the contributions Native Americans had made to the war effort. In the years after World War II, Ernest Childers became an advocate for Native American rights and veterans' issues. He understood that his Medal of Honor gave him a platform. People would listen to him in a way they might not listen to other Native Americans. He decided to use that platform to make a difference. Ernest spoke out about the need to honor treaties with Native American tribes. He advocated for better education and economic opportunities on reservations. He worked to preserve Native American culture and language, which had been under attack for generations. He reminded people that Native Americans had served their country with distinction and deserved to be treated with respect and dignity. He also worked with veterans organizations to help other soldiers who were struggling with the transition to civilian life. Ernest understood the challenges of dealing with combat trauma. Today, we call it post-traumatic stress disorder, but back then it was called shell shock or combat fatigue, and many people didn't take it seriously. Ernest knew that many veterans were suffering in silence, and he tried to help them find support. Ernest became the director of the National Guard for the state of Oklahoma. In this role, he worked to improve training and readiness for National Guard units. He also worked to recruit more Native Americans into military service.
He saw the military as a path to opportunity for young Native Americans who might not have many other options. He wanted them to have the same chance to prove themselves that he had been given. Throughout his post-war life, Ernest remained humble about his Medal of Honor. He didn't talk about himself as a hero. He talked about the men he had served with, the friends he had lost, and the importance of service to something greater than oneself. He deflected attention away from his own actions and tried to focus on the broader contributions of Native Americans to the war effort. Ernest also worked to ensure that other Native American Medal of Honor recipients were properly recognized. He attended ceremonies and events honoring military service. He made sure that the sacrifices of Native American soldiers weren't forgotten. He built bridges between the Native American community and the broader veterans community.
Ernest Childers passed away on March 17, 2005, at the age of 87. He had lived a full life marked by courage, service, and advocacy. His death was noted across the country, with newspapers and veterans organizations paying tribute to his heroism and his contributions to Native American rights. In the years since his death, Ernest's legacy has continued to grow. Schools and buildings have been named in his honor. Memorials have been dedicated to him and other Native American Medal of Honor recipients. Books and documentaries have told his story to new generations. The state of Oklahoma has honored him as one of its greatest heroes. The Creek Nation has celebrated Ernest as one of their most distinguished members. His story is taught to young Creek children as an example of courage, determination, and service. He represents the warrior tradition of the Creek people adapted to the modern world. He proved that Native Americans could excel in any field they chose, including military service at the highest levels. Ernest's Medal of Honor is displayed at the 45th Infantry Division Museum in Oklahoma City. It serves as a reminder of the sacrifices made by the men and women of that division and of the special contributions of Native American soldiers. The museum tells the full story of the 45th Infantry Division's service in World War II, and Ernest's Medal of Honor is one of its centerpiece artifacts. In 2013, on the 70th anniversary of the battle where Ernest earned his Medal of Honor, a special ceremony was held in Oklahoma to honor his memory. Veterans, Native American leaders, and government officials gathered to remember what Ernest had done and what he had represented. It was a powerful reminder that heroism and sacrifice should never be forgotten, no matter how many years pass. Ernest Childers' story is remarkable on its own, but it's also part of a much larger story about Native Americans in World War II. More than 44,000 Native Americans served in the war, and their contributions went far beyond just fighting. The famous Navajo code talkers used their language to create an unbreakable code that the Japanese never cracked. Native American pilots flew fighters and bombers. Native American women served as nurses and in support roles. The warrior tradition that had been part of Native American culture for thousands of years found new expression in World War II. Young Native American men saw military service as a way to honor their ancestors and prove their courage. They brought skills learned from traditional hunting and tracking into modern warfare. They served with distinction in every theater of the war, from Europe to the Pacific to North Africa. But the story of Native American service in World War II is also a story about the complicated relationship between indigenous peoples and the United States government. Native Americans served a country that had spent centuries trying to destroy their cultures and take their lands. They fought for freedom and democracy abroad while being denied full rights at home. This contradiction was not lost on Native American veterans like Ernest Childers. After World War II, Native American veterans became leaders in the movement for indigenous rights. They had proven their loyalty and courage beyond any doubt, and they demanded that the government honor its obligations to Native peoples. The veterans movement was a crucial part of the broader Native American rights movement that would gain momentum in the 1960s and 1970s. Ernest's story reminds us that heroism comes in all colors and from all backgrounds. It challenges the stereotypes and prejudices that have been used to discriminate against Native Americans. It shows that when given the opportunity, Native Americans can achieve anything.
Ernest didn't just fight for his country. He fought against the idea that Native Americans were somehow lesser or incapable.
What can we learn from the story of Ernest Childers? First, we learn that courage isn't about being fearless. Ernest felt fear just like anyone else. But he acted despite that fear. He did what needed to be done even when it terrified him. True courage is taking action in the face of fear, not the absence of fear itself. Second, we learn about the importance of leadership. Ernest didn't just save his own life on September 22, 1943. He saved the lives of countless other soldiers by breaking the German defensive position. His leadership and example inspired the men around him to do things they might not have thought possible. Good leadership in any field, whether military or civilian, is about bringing out the best in others and showing them what's possible. Third, we learn about the destructive nature of prejudice and discrimination. Ernest Childers had to overcome obstacles that had nothing to do with his abilities or character. He faced discrimination because of his race and heritage. Imagine how many other potential Ernest Childers have been held back by prejudice throughout history. How many people with incredible potential never got the chance to show what they could do because society decided they were inferior based on the color of their skin or their ethnic background? Fourth, we learn about the complexity of patriotism. Ernest served a country that had not always treated him or his people well. He fought for values of freedom and equality that weren't fully extended to Native Americans. But he believed in those values anyway. He believed they were worth fighting for, even if the country hadn't lived up to them yet. His service was a challenge to America to become the country it claimed to be. Finally, we learned that individual actions matter. One man, armed with courage and determination, changed the outcome of a battle. Ernest could have stayed in cover on September 22, 1943. No one would have blamed him. He was already injured. He had already done his part. But he chose to act, and that choice saved lives and changed history. We all face moments in our lives where we have to choose between doing what's easy and doing what's right. Ernest's story reminds us that those choices matter. Ernest Childers was more than a Medal of Honor recipient. He was a Creek Indian who proved that Native Americans deserved respect and equality. He was a soldier who showed incredible courage under fire. He was a leader who inspired men in the most difficult circumstances imaginable. He was an advocate who worked to improve the lives of veterans and Native Americans. And he was a human being who faced the same fears and struggles we all face, but chose to act with courage and integrity. His story deserves to be remembered and retold. It deserves to be taught in schools. It deserves to be celebrated not just by Native Americans or veterans, but by all Americans. Ernest Childers represents the best of what we can be when we choose courage over fear, service over selfishness, and action over inaction. So remember the name Ernest Childers. Remember the first Native American to win the Medal of Honor in World War II. Remember the Creek warrior from Oklahoma who charged German machine gun nests despite a broken foot. Remember the leader who saved lives through his courage and tactical brilliance. Remember the advocate who worked to improve the lives of others. And remember that his story, like so many stories of heroism and sacrifice, almost disappeared into the shadows of history. That's why your engagement matters. That's why sharing this story matters. Hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment telling me what you think. Share this video with others. Because heroes like Ernest Childers shouldn't be forgotten. Their stories need to be passed on to future generations. They need to inspire young people to be brave, to serve others, and to stand up for what's right. Ernest Childers did his part. Now it's our turn to make sure his legacy lives on.